Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander. Today we're going to talk about global governance. And in the past few weeks, we have seen just a stark contrast on display between the vision that's been put forward by China and what the United States is putting forward. In fact, just last week, U.S. President Donald Trump appeared before the United Nations General Assembly and gave what many described as a rambling speech. A lot of people on the right in the United States said it was impressive and said it was definitive. I'll let you decide as to what you thought of the speech. He seemed more angry about broken escalators and teleprompters, but nonetheless, there was a vision in there. Let me play a few highlights for you from Trump's speech, and then it's going to contrast sharply with some of the things that we're hearing coming out of Beijing.
What is the purpose of the United Nations? For now, all they seem to do is write a really strongly worded letter and then never follow that letter up. You're destroying your countries. They're being destroyed. Both the immigration and their suicidal energy ideas will be the death of Western Europe. I'm really good at this stuff. Your countries are going to hell. It's climate change. Because if it goes higher or lower, whatever the hell happens, there's climate change. It's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, in my opinion. Best-selling hat. Trump was right about everything. And I don't say that in a braggadocious way, but it's true. I've been right about everything.
Now, I did not pick those sound bites to make Trump look bad in any way. That's just the way he sounded through an hour-long speech, if you took a listen to it. Interesting points there about the United Nations. This has been a talking point that they've had for the past couple of weeks, saying that it has potential. And a lot of people are now starting to hear in between the words on MAGA foreign policy that the United States is going to withdraw even further from the United Nations. And of course, this comes just as China is leading into the UN and the multilateral system a lot more. So back in September, early September, on the 1st, Chinese President Xi Jinping hosted the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, and it was there that he unveiled a new initiative. Now, remember, we have a number of these so-called initiatives. We've got the Global Civilization Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global AI Initiative, and now President Xi unveiled the Global Governance Initiative. Let's take a listen to President Xi's speech at the SCO Plus group. That was where leaders from other countries beyond the core members of the SCO were attending, where Xi unveiled the GGI.
Global governance has come to a new crossroads. History tells us that at difficult times, we must uphold our regional commitment to peaceful coexistence, strengthen our confidence in win-win cooperation, advance in line with the trend of history, and thrive in keeping pace with the times. To this end, I wish to propose the Global Governance Initiative. It follows my previous global initiatives, namely Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiative. And today, I propose to you the Global Governance Initiative. I look forward to working with all countries for a more just and equitable global governance system and advancing toward a community with a shared future for humanity.
And like the Global Development Initiative, the Global Governance Initiative is firmly anchored in the United Nations, and it ties a lot of the goals of the UN's, the Sustainable Development Goals, and other objectives, particularly related to multilateralism, to the United Nations. Now, since Xi's speech back on September 1st, China's state media apparatus has been in overdrive to promote the GGI, both on their channels, but as we're going to also see around the world, and to try and drive acceptance of it. Here's what it sounds like on Chinese state broadcaster CGTN in a talk show hosted by Wong, who provides a bit more detail on the GGI and the rationale behind it.
From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wong.
Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wong. This week in Tianjin, China hosted the largest ever summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO. And the deliverables from this year's summits are remarkable. First of all, at the Tianjin summit, President Xi Jinping of China proposed the Global Governance Initiative, or GGI. This is the latest vision proposed by the Chinese leader on top of his global initiatives on development, security, and civilization. Now put together, they represent China's vision of a fair world order and China's solutions to making it a reality. It calls for equal and orderly multipolarization of global affairs and a more just and equitable global governance system with economic development at its core. It is also saying that the era of one or two countries calling all the shots should end and must end. Instead of great powers issuing ultimatums, China wants dialogue over division, cooperation over zero-sum games.
So a lot of code words there for the United States, and she also made reference to these code words, and you'll hear this throughout the conversation around the GGI. Those one or two countries, well, it's really one country. It's the United States. It's that Cold War mentality. That's a lot of a Chinese talking point as well. They talk about hegemonic behavior. They talk about unilateralism. And so the GGI is supposed to be the antidote to that. And so they say a more fair and equitable international governance system, which is a message, of course, that will resonate quite loudly in the global South. But if you're sitting in London or Tokyo or New York, you're probably not hearing a lot about the GGI because obviously it's not something that is in high demand. And at the same time, it's also probably met with quite a bit of suspicion. But if you're pretty much anywhere else in the global South, in Latin America, especially in Africa, you are getting hit hard with messaging about the GGI, largely through China's relationships that it has with media entities across the developing world. These are these content sharing agreements, which connects Xinhua, China Daily, and People's Daily feeds directly into these news sites, and it's making its way through there. It's been quite impressive. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, we noticed in our coverage in Africa that within a 3 or 4 day period, newspapers in Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Liberia, and Kenya all featured prominent paid media placements from Chinese ambassadors to talk about the GGI. In fact, in Kenya, Ambassador Guo Haiyan's column appeared on the same day in all 3 of the country's leading dailies. That's the Star, Daily Nation, and the Standard. And it just gives you an indication of the kind of full court press that the Chinese are pushing in terms of promoting the GGI. And they've also organized forums with journalists in order to have them help amplify what the GGI is. Let's take a listen now to a seminar or a coverage of a seminar organized by CGTN's Kiswahili service in Kenya. And here's Kenya's KUTV and their coverage.
Now, the Global Governance Symposium put Africa at the center of growing global conversation at the stakeholders, emphasize the Global South's role in driving inclusive economic growth, sustainable development, and fairer international cooperation. The forum, anchored on China's Global Governance Initiative, underscored Africa's push to move from being a passive player to an active shaper of global rules and reforms at a time of deep economic, political, and climate uncertainty.
So what you're hearing there is part of China's efforts to localize the narrative around the GGI. And a big part of the strategy is also to get key influencers, not just media, to also take on the mantle and promote the GGI. Let's take a listen now to former Pakistani Foreign Minister Bilwal Bhutto Zardari speaking about the GGI on CGTN.
I think is particularly important given the challenges that the international community are facing today. The advocacy or the promotion of international law, of following a rules-based order of multilateralism and cooperation is the only way for us to internationally meet the governance challenges of today, whether it is in the form of climate change, whether it is in the form of terrorism, whether it's in the form of a global pandemic. In the modern day, no country is an island, or no people are even an island unto themselves. So I believe that this new initiative has come at exactly the right time, when the global order is being challenged, and we're seeing a lot more disorder than we're seeing order. It is China that brings this stable hand by advocating for multilateralism in a rules-based order.
That's the official narrative organized and propagated by Beijing about the Global Governance Initiative. But clearly, there's a lot of demand for a change in the international order, especially from what we're seeing coming out of Washington, where Washington also wants to change the rules. But let's get a perspective now from someone who follows this very closely, and I've been very excited to have him on the show to ask him a lot of questions about China's global governance. Brian Wong is an assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong, my alma mater, and also a fellow at HKU's Center on Contemporary China and the World. And he's also the author of a new book that came out this year, Moral Debt, Defending a New Account of Reparative Justice, as well as co-edited a volume with Professor Tang He-Wei, Towards a Future for BRICS. Plus, he joins us from a very rainy, typhoon-drenched Hong Kong. A very good morning to you, Brian, and thank you for joining us.
Morning, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Brian, it's wonderful to have you at this time in history to be able to show us what's going on. You see these very stark messages that came out of the United Nations just last week. Li Qiang, Prime Minister from China, he spoke at the UN. Trump also spoke at the UN. We've heard about the Global Governance Initiative. Before we get into the GGI and the details about it, I'm just curious your take on these sharply contrasting worldviews that we see coming from the US and China.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. And I think it's worth noting that we shouldn't overstate the extent to which the worldviews espoused by Premier Li Qiang as the number two nominally in the government, or indeed Donald Trump. We shouldn't construe these statements as representative of what China, quote unquote, or America are thinking. Both are incredibly heterogeneous and diverse entities unto themselves, of course. But I presume the question really is more anchored, right, in and centered around the governments of both countries. And as they stand, what Trump has essentially projected over the past 8 months or so of his second term is certainly a rather stark departure from not just Biden, but also his very first term, where some of his most insidious tendencies in the first term were exacerbated and amplified. And where the constraints and checks and balances that you saw during the first term, he's essentially gone ahead and promulgated a vision of a world, not a world order, because there's no order, so to speak, but a world where power and might thereby generate normative oughts and rights in his view. And that also explained, by the way, his willingness to engage in all of these amoral and dare I say, almost anti-moralism transactions and bargains with governments and regimes that are not necessarily the most legitimate, democratic, or indeed benign in their own right, so to speak. But secondly, too, he is very skeptical towards multilateral institutions and the thought that America has to essentially shoulder the burden for transnational challenges ranging from climate change through to public health. And you can see that with regards to his, pretty abrasive statements towards both, in a former case, the Paris Agreement and COP in general, and in the latter case, of course, WHO, from which he withdrew America for the second time. And a final tenet of his worldview is an emphasis upon personalities as opposed to states. And this, I think, is often neglected in current commentaries, where folks tend to look at, the fact that he enjoys associating with individuals, leading non-democratic regimes or strongmen, quote unquote. But what really undergirds this, in my view, is Trump's fundamental conviction that diplomacy, or indeed politicking, is best accomplished through interpersonal relations. And that's why he goes around saying things like, I'm a very good friend of Putin, and we get along very nicely.
And Xi as well. He likes to talk about Xi.
He loves talking about his personal rapport with a lot of these leaders. And that's because he sees this as not just conducive towards, but demonstrative of his credibility. And that is why he enjoys bypassing institutional channels and mechanisms of governance in order to get his way. So now let's take a look at the Chinese the Chinese state's approach to foreign policy as espoused by Li Qiang's rhetoric at the recent UNGA, but also you look at a Summer Davos speech for more clues and hints. My first observation is Beijing, having benefited so extensively from, is keen to maintain the broadly multilateral world order that had lasted for the first 3 decades after the Cold War. This doesn't mean that they're doing this out of altruistic motivations. They're not doing this because they enjoy, multilateral peace and believe firmly in the ethical code of empowering small and medium states. But instead, it's because they, by and large, have benefited from liberalization of trade, removal of tariffs and capital and investment barriers, as well as, of course, a greater inclusion and incorporation of the global south, albeit, might I add, not fast enough, into existing multilateral institutions ranging from the UN to the World Bank and the IMF. So that also explains why it is out of self-interest that Beijing sees it as conducive and imperative to defend the multilateral order in whatever way or shape or form it perceives it to be, manifesting specifically as. And a second tenet, too, is that I think China is gradually recognizing that there are opportunities and low-hanging fruits at that to be gleaned and acquired through its stepping up to more, global challenge or more of taking up more of the mantle, right, in dealing with global challenges ranging from the climate to food insecurity to macroeconomic instability and AI governance. And that also in part explains, the raft of GIs, right, global initiatives that have emerged over the past couple of years from China. There is certainly value when it comes to soft power, right? The soft power element in bolstering China's profile. But more substantively, if you look at the actual meat on the ground here, right? Climate change, ergo renewables and renewable transition. Food insecurity, thereby food production and biotechnology. And finally, the AI revolution, and in conjunction with it, the robotics revolution, ergo, the favoring of the robotics industries and sectors. All of these are sectors in which the Chinese economy, through a mixture of state-led industrial policy, but also the bottom-up competitive and hyper-competitive drive amongst entrepreneurs, has become increasingly suited and well-positioned in leading. So again, it is not out of the altruism and the beneficence of the leaders in charge in Beijing that they're now driving forward these global initiatives, that's for sure. On the flip side, I would say if what we're seeing coming out of China is a lowering of costs, if that's a net benefit, the lowering of the costs required to access these goods, the promulgation of more international resource allocation towards these areas that America is now shirking its responsibilities in relation to, then it might not entirely be a bad thing that China is actually stepping up to fill the vacuum left behind by the US.
Let's just jump in there on these global initiatives that you talked about. And just to echo what you were saying, Ambassador Guo Haiyan from Kenya, in her multi-newspaper editorials that they placed, wrote, China's proposal of the GGI does not mean to overturn the existing international order or to create another framework outside of the current international system. Now, that is written far more clear than when you actually read the documents about these various global initiatives: security, development, civilization, and now, of course, governance, which are just notoriously vague and ambiguous. There are these broad statements that China wants a more fair system, a more balanced system, more multilateral system, but that can be really interpreted in lots of different ways. A little bit like the Belt and Road Initiative, where there was no charter of the Belt and Road. There's no Belt and Road Secretariat in Beijing. The Belt and Road is a little bit like, well, whatever you want it to be at any point in time, it can be a Belt and Road Initiative. So talk to us a little bit about the architecture of these initiatives. Why is China doing them, and why are they so vague?
Brilliant. I actually came up with a term for this usage of rhetoric or discourses by the Chinese state to create what I call political openings and political spaces for them to prosecute more specific initiatives down the line. And I coined a term, dexterous ambiguity. Dexterity in a sense that these terms are ultimately malleable, flexible, and elastic in what they encompass in both their core and penumbra, but also ambiguous because ultimately, when I say to you, I firmly believe in fairness and equality, you would say, yeah, me too, So it's so ambiguous. It's so fundamentally bromide E, right? It's almost anodyne to the point where it's very hard to find anyone who disagree with. I'm going to read out here, for
That's right.
instance.
Do you like puppies? I mean, who doesn't
Right.
like puppies, right? Everybody loves
Exactly.
puppies.
Who doesn't like puppies? And a global governance initiative, right, essentially argues for the adherence to sovereign equality, abiding by international rule of law, practicing multilateralism, advocating people-centered approach, and focusing on taking concrete actions, which is somewhat interesting there. All 5 principles are just fundamentally so undisagreeable that you'd find yourself surprised if you thought, wow, this is very jarring, right? And that's the beauty, but also the kind of craftiness of Chinese state discourses. They are engineered in a way that means that critics who take a stance against them, purportedly, or cynics or skeptics, can be easily framed as those who do not agree with the greatest common denominator, quote unquote, of what they call a community of common destiny, right? But on the flip side, what this ambiguity and vagueness also allow Chinese state organs to do, and I'll talk about BRI very shortly, is enables them to basically adapt their initiatives and adapt the policies they roll out to actual circumstances on the ground and the realpolitik motivations. And that is why the claim that the GGI or all these other global initiatives are strictly doctrinally ideological, I don't buy into that. For there isn't much of a consistent ideology undergirding these initiatives. Some might say, oh, it's Marxism and Leninism, and others would say it's hyper-nationalistic Chinese revanchism. But if you read these initiatives in the content, I don't see traces of either in the GCI or indeed in the GGI and the GAII.
Can I just stop you there very quickly before we go on? If there isn't an ideological thread that sews these all up together, help us understand, what are the Chinese trying to do with this? What is the objective of it? So we know that, for example, the Global Development Initiative was spurred by the fact that the Chinese had been frustrated with the World Bank, the IMF, the Global Development Finance community, that they don't have the share of the votes in those institutions that they're warranted, given the fact that they are the second largest economy in the world, and yet they don't have the second largest votes in those institutions. The Global Civilization Initiative was launched in part because they want to redefine human rights and national sovereignty issues and things like that. A global security initiative was purpose-built against NATO and the U.S. alliances. So there are some of those, but those are not threads that bind these together. So if there's no ideological undercurrent, what are they trying to do with these things? What's the objective?
Very good question. I know it is almost truistic to say that the CPC as a regime is bent on preserving and also entrenching its power and stability of rule. There is merit in noting this, because whenever we look at China's actions, there's a dangerous tendency to project all sorts of ideological meta-narratives and grand visions onto what the party does. Whereas in practice, perhaps the motivations are far more mundane. How can I keep myself as an official? How can I keep my party as the party leadership? And how can I keep, in general, the state apparatus, which includes non-party members or co-opted members or United Front, you name it, in power? And if you look at China's actions through those lenses, then what it's doing internationally is certainly, important in their own right, but ultimately the fundamental core gist of that is about servicing the domestic policy and political agenda of the leadership. And then we can look at the various means in which you can cash this out and how this has evolved over time, the sort of link between foreign and domestic policy. Because you're right, Eric, it started off being the case that many of these initiatives, alongside the BRI and all the other sort of institutions such as the AIIB as a part of BRI, the NDB in relation to BRICS, it started off being really as a critique of, but also as a vocal protest towards what China perceived to be an under-representation or under-inclusion, so to speak, in existing international institutions such as the World Bank, but also to a lesser extent the IMF, and of course the United Nations. Although on the front of the United Nations, there is certainly a significant increase and spike in activity over the past 15 years on the part of Chinese diplomats. And you can read Kevin Rudd's book, actually, for pretty detailed coverage of that, or Rosemary Foote's writings on that front. But speaking specifically then to the thought of, beyond just constructing these alternatives, why else is China pursuing, these initiatives? I think the first motivation there is largely economic, as I highlighted just then, whether it be AI, renewables, advanced manufacturing, or even food and health technologies, which I predict would make a significant splash in the upcoming 15th five-year plan, especially the food front. All of these are industries and sectors where Chinese companies, whether they be SOEs or private enterprises, have increasingly, if not already established a significant foothold, right? And thereby in promulgating and raising, the public and global understanding and awareness of the salience of the problems at hand, this also generates both a natural demand as well as a deference to the sort of economic rules and agenda setting that the state would like to see through over the coming years. And this is how China, by the way, sustains its ability to export and to be the world's manufacturing and also exporting powerhouse, even amidst intensifying protectionism and trade barriers from the states. So I think the first objective there is actually economic. It's not ideology, it's not propaganda, but I'll go against that shortly, but it's instead about, quite literally raw cash and also resource
so you
affluence.
don't see this about political power and geopolitical competition with the United States and the Western-led international order?
I don't think so, right? For ultimately, the Chinese leadership is of the view that whoever emerges with a stronger, more self-sufficient, more self-reliant, and ultimately competitive economy with more what they call political unity, 团结, or stability, 社会稳定, then that is going to be the winner, quote unquote, in a great power rivalry. They're a firm believer in sort of the marathon model of competition as opposed to the gladiator model of competition, right? And this does not mean, once again, that they are altruistic, benign actors. It just means that they are pretty pragmatic, okay? What's China good at doing? Well, it's getting its own house in order, building up, at least a moderately robust and enduring economy, and getting folks to buy into the regime. Of course, there have been challenges, over the past couple of years, whether it be in terms of the private sector, youth unemployment, and more generally speaking, wariness on the part of the middle class concerning, living costs as well as the unpredictability of policies. But by and large, the Chinese state knows its forte rests with domestic governance and stabilization. What it's not good at doing, and that's also why it has been quite wary of doing so over the past 70 years, is to wage proxy or direct wars against large powers around the world. And that is why China, ever since, the beginning of the Cold War, indeed the establishment of the country, has only fought a handful of major wars against its neighbors in the Korean War, and the Sino-Indian War, and of course the Sino-Vietnamese War. None of this is to say that China is dispositionally peaceful. I don't buy into the argument that the Chinese people don't like fighting. I mean, all you need to do is to go to a Shenzhen, a supermarket right before a typhoon, and you realize, and you'd see a lot of folks clamoring over, baskets of bread. But it does mean that the state is more pragmatic than its quote-unquote Western counterparts, including governments who see starting a war each and every year as in the interest of its people, which I just do not quite fathom, so to speak.
Let me, again, some people may find what you're saying a little bit confusing, and also what we're hearing from the Chinese as well. So they talk about this more equitable, more peaceful, more fair international order. You talk about how it's more economically driven, yet if you are a claimant in the South China Sea, namely the Philippines, you don't see China being more equitable and more fair. If you are in Japan, where the Chinese have violated the EEZs and in some cases even the airspace of the Japanese, triggering the Japanese to send fighter jets up, well, you're wondering, what is this new global governance initiative that they're putting forward if that's happening? Obviously, in Vietnam, there are territorial disputes. There are major territorial disputes with India that are still unresolved. So all of these questions here in Asia really prompt a lot of people to go, well, wait a minute, they're saying this, and you're talking about economics, but at the end of the day, there's tens of thousands of Chinese PLA soldiers massed on the southern border with India right now. There is a naval deployment in the South China Sea that is absolutely massive. On the other side, we also see this very strong rhetoric about the United States. And so in Washington, a lot of people rightly feel like, well, listen, China wants to replace us. And I say rightly only because the rhetoric coming out of Beijing is in many ways equaled only to the rhetoric coming out of Washington in terms of the mutual disdain that they have for one another. So again, in this context of geopolitical competition, hard military power in the Asia-Pacific region, how does this rhetoric stack up? How do we understand and process what we're hearing? That's, I think, the struggle that a lot of people are trying to figure out.
Brilliant question, and you've hit a nail on the head, Eric. The first one I want to note before I delve into my answers in details. I think ultimately, if China is to become what it promises to be, a responsible global power, it really needs to understand the world exists beyond a binary. And it is very counterproductive and unconducive for Chinese sort of state-affiliated intelligentsia, alternatively foreign policy experts, to reduce everything and all around them, including South China Sea dispute, Sino-Indian tensions, the Korean Peninsula, or the Taiwan Straits, especially the former 3 out of the 4, into merely a sort of proxy struggle between China and the US. The Philippines, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, India, these are all states that have their own foreign policy agenda and also a desire for, as well as exhibition of, strategic autonomy. If the Chinese insist that they are indeed a peaceful power and are indeed committed to a peaceful rise, one needs to reassure many of its neighbors that it is serious about such commitments of peace, and as well as dispelling narratives that portray it to be a revanchist and revisionist power by accommodating more multilateral institutions such as the UN, for instance, and arbitration and mediation institutions within that as a part of how it's dealing with territorial disputes. This sort of winner-take-all mentality of saying, we cannot give an inch or you'll take a foot, that sort of mindset reveals insecurity as opposed to the kind of confidence that, frankly, with its economic might and potency, China ought to enjoy and display a tad more, actually substantially more explicitly. So in short, I'm inclined to agree with you, Eric. There's a need on the part of the Chinese establishment to rethink its approach to its periphery and recognize that it is not waging an existential struggle against proxy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the US, that if it sees the world through such a binary and Manichean manner, well, it could very well drive these countries then into the arms of its strategic rivals, including but not limited to the US per se. The first comment I'll make on top of this, though, is economics, does in fact, in my view, hold up and can be seen as sort of the enduring pillar of China's relationship with its neighbors, even those with whom it shares a very taut and also tense, geopolitical and military relationship. If you look at Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, and India, China counts amongst the largest trading partners to each and every one of them, if not the largest, so to speak, right? And it's really ebbs and flows and varies in accordance with the exact year that we're talking about here. But by and large, the trade relations between China and all of these neighboring states, right, that do have and harbor skepticism towards China have been going strong for the past 10 years. And in my view, they should continually deepen, with a caveat that Beijing must also watch out for the backlash and reprobation it's going to receive over the exporting of excess, supply and also overcapacity, so to speak. And that's another problem we can get into shortly. But beyond the economics, when it comes to the perceptions and judgments of Beijing's intentions, this is a huge issue. And that also explains why, and this is the second reason why these global initiatives have been trotted out over the past decade or so, which is that Beijing is very much keen on strengthening its institutional credibility, especially in the eyes of skeptical countries, parties, or individuals. And it knows quite well by now, having learned it the hard way, that the sort of assertive, mouth-frothing, vociferous diplomatic antics and rhetorics he saw coming out of the MFA a couple of years ago, wolf warrior diplomacy. I've written on this actually, saying that it was geared more towards domestic consumption anyway. So it wasn't really, diplomacy. It was more wolf warrior posturing for domestic audiences, which didn't play out as neatly as expected either. But one way or the other, they've come to the realization in Beijing that this needs to change. They cannot possibly be seeking to build, multilateral partnerships and engage in navigating of a multipolar world when they come across basically as a mirror image of the US, even if that's not actually accurate, right? And I say that, with reference to the actual disparities in military commitments. The US has over 700 bases all around the world, whereas China has one in Djibouti, and it might be building another one in Oman, or you can count a Cambodian one as one, but that's two. right? Maybe in part the Korean base, okay? So that's 2 versus, hundreds. And if you look at the number of wars fought, again, the US has fought, 1.4, 1.5 wars on average per year over the past 70 years. In the case of the Chinese state, at least when it comes to kinetic warfare, I think the number is far smaller, right? So that goes to show why whenever I try to speak with, friends who are very skeptical of China and the States, I just present to them numbers and I say, look, you tell me that China is a military threat. Right, but let's take a look at the actual numbers and stats there. Doesn't mean that China is not aggressive in some other ways. Doesn't mean that China isn't committed to non-intervention, full stop, right? Obviously, there are gray areas and questions over, presence of if agents of influence, for instance, or how discursively through propaganda they're seeking to shape the hearts and minds of countries.
Yes, as we're seeing with the GGI narratives, as we talked about at the top of the show.
These tactics are by no means sort of warmongering insofar as they're just seeking to influence and shape domestic politics via non-military means. And that perhaps goes to explain or complete the picture when it comes to why Beijing is so keen on advancing these global initiatives, so to speak. It's not just economic, I agree with you. It's also about bolstering their perceived credibility and achieving, of course, subtler forms of influence, which frankly, Beijing has got a long way to go when it comes to learning how to do it subtly and effectively. If you look at the sort of quote-unquote influence tactics and discursive tactics adopted by Chinese diplomats and their associates, they've still got to learn how to speak to people as opposed to speak down to people, or alternatively speak to domestic audiences using a foreign language, because that ain't diplomacy and that ain't effective.
I mean, they are at once very crude and very unsophisticated, and at the same time highly sophisticated. And so what we see in Africa, for example, as we've just seen with the rollout of the GGI, is in many ways mirrored by corporate communication tactics, paid media placements, media training seminars, content integrations with local newspapers, all of these different tactics that corporations use to promote, say, a new technology product or a new service. The Chinese use in their public diplomacy. They are light years ahead of what other governments are doing in that space. But to your point, in terms of the personal touch of the ambassadors, for example, when they speak publicly, oftentimes not very polished on that. I'm glad you mentioned Kevin Rudd earlier on. Kevin Rudd, of course, is one of the great China scholars of our time, for those people who are not familiar with it. He's a former Australian prime minister. He's the former head of the Asia Society Policy Institute. He's a former Australian ambassador to China. Now, what is his role now? He's got another high role, I forget. But he came out with a definitive book on Xi Jinping last year. I think it was last year. And I highly recommend this book for people to read, but it is not for the faint at heart. It really does read like his PhD dissertation that he recently finished. It is a tough slog to get through, but it is absolutely essential if you want to understand Xi and the ideological kind of architecture that he has to his thinking, and how, just as Trump is the most transformational president that the United States has had in more than a century, Xi in many ways is as transformational as Mao or any other Chinese leader that we've seen in a long time. Now, Kevin Rudd puts these global initiatives as part of the broader framework of the Community for Common Destiny, CCD. You mentioned that at the beginning. A lot of scholars dispute that. I've had conversations with a number of different scholars who say, no, these governance initiatives are separate, and Community for Common Destiny is actually not even a Xi initiative. This started under the Hu Jintao era. Help us understand, where do these governance initiatives, where are they rooted? Where do they come from within the Chinese body politic, and specifically within the Xi ideology?
Well, look, I think you're absolutely right, Eric, that there's a lot of disputes over what the central organizing concept is with regards to Chinese foreign policy. But if I may, just as an intervention on a meta level, I'd say that the current regime, the incumbent administration in Beijing, really is quite, ideologically oriented when it comes to domestic economic policies, and also to some extent political and governance-oriented policies. But it's also rather pragmatic, on the other hand, when it comes to foreign policy. So the pragmatism here doesn't translate to necessarily optimizing for diplomatic wins or partnerships, mind you. Instead, it means that they are seeking to optimize certain results that are more explicitly, personal interest oriented vis-a-vis the more ideologically loaded approach to governance, especially when it comes to domestic economics, right? So during COVID, for instance, and also in the run-up to COVID, there was this sort of surge in assertiveness, entrenchedness, and also disparaging defensiveness that you saw from Chinese diplomats. My explanation for that was because the regime was optimizing for domestic audience oriented, satisfaction, right? Attempting to drum up nationalistic sentiments, to reinforce the notion that China is strong as a way of, basically boosting morale amidst a rather trying period for China in the initial stages of the pandemic. And then subsequently, in the 1.5 years after China managed to basically contain the spread of the pandemic, it was about, talking up China as a state vis-a-vis what was going on in the West. So therefore, there's a pragmatism and a pragmatic streak in its foreign policy, right? And over the past 2.5 years, as I called for and advocated in an article 2 years ago, China or Chinese leaders have taken a more reconciliation-oriented, a more amicable approach in the way foreign policy representatives and officials interact with their counterparts, right? Some have called this a charm offensive. I've called this basically a rhetorical and discursive reset in an attempt to stabilize investor confidence and sentiments, to repair relations with the global north, and to take advantage of the unilateralist retreat and withdrawal of America from global and multilateral institutions, as you've seen over the past 3 quarters. So in short, I don't think it's conducive to say, okay, this is a word that helps us understand everything there is to do with Chinese foreign policy. And of course, CCD would then, given this, count as amongst one of many different words, key umbrella terms, or as Rudd puts it, banner terms, that allows us to understand parts of the foreign policy. Another term that we might see as useful is the rejuvenation, right? The sort of national rejuvenation, or the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is linked inevitably and inextricably with the Chinese dream. And that,
Yes,
in
the
turn,
Zhongguomeng.
is, a Xi word, right? And probably something that he did, in fact, come up with himself as he started to promote this, I believe, in Q4 2012, shortly after the 18th Party Congress, so to speak. So, 中华民族伟大复兴, great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. 中国梦, Chinese dream. The argument that the world is becoming more multipolar, 世界多极化. Right? All of these, in turn, are related with and connected with the 全人类命运共同体, so the CCD that Rudd talks about. And when you situate all these terms in a broader context, what is the diagnosis that keeps coming up again and again in Chinese state media discourses and ideological texts? It's the assessment that we're living in 百年未见的大变局, changes unseen in 100 years.
And just let me just stop you right there, because that particular phrase, the changes not seen in 100 years, in your estimation, and we talked about this earlier, in your estimation, is more important as a framing tool than these governing initiatives, for example, or even CCD in your view. And we hear this come up quite a bit in all of Wang Yi and Liu Jiantao, who was the Communist Party's foreign policy czar before he was, I think, under investigation. I don't know if he's still under investigation. But Xi himself will talk about the changes not seen in 100 years. So that, rather than focus on the governance initiatives, you're suggesting that that framing is probably more important to understand how the Chinese policy elites are thinking in terms of how they see the world today.
That's right. I think they see an opening, right? They see an opening in the existing global political structures, and that there are opportunities to be taken. And if I could sort of quote one of my favorite theorists of all time, Antonio Gramsci once said, "The old world is dying and a new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." I'm not convinced the leadership in Beijing is particularly enamored with the final line or the final segment of this quote, but by and large, they would agree with the assessment that the old world, as they see it, is dying. And this assessment was in turn perhaps, sparked initially by the 2008 global financial crisis, which led to, of course, the promulgation of the seeds of thought that suggest Dongsheng Xijiang, the so-called assertion that the East is rising and the West is declining, which is bandied around as a favorite by the state. And then subsequently, now we're in a phase where if we are indeed taking, after the periodization of history, as Marxists would like to do or carry out, we're now in a period where the old world is dying. That's period one. Period two, the new world is struggling to be born, right? So the question here is, what exactly would this new world look like? CCD is one part of that new world order, but then so is, 全球南方, the global south. And that's why China talks a lot about South-South cooperation in its discourse, even though we're not, China is in fact a part of the global south, should remain a part of the global south, is a developing or not a developing country. These are all very interesting questions and sticking points for contention between China and other developing countries in the world. And in fact, I'm glad we're doing this podcast after the UNGA, because I believe Li Qiang just announced rather recently, as of yesterday or the day before, that China would no longer be, or is willing to give up the benefits and the favorable treatment afforded to it by the developing nation status in the WTO. And that, I think, is a rather important pronouncement.
That is an important distinction, because China's
always
always said it's a developing country. And this has kind of permeated Chinese thinking that it's still a poor developing country, and that is the end. And yet,
for new WTO agreements, I don't think he's revoking or he's giving up on what they currently have, but is saying for new agreements, they're happy to not have access to special and differential treatment above the interruptions.
This has always been a contradiction in China's presentation to the world, because on the one hand, if you go onto X, all you see from Chinese diplomats and Chinese supporters and surrogates is how Chongqing is now the modern city, and you have subways in Chengdu that are way more advanced than anything else you'll see in the West.
It's
and they'll
really
contrast kind of
really
the Shanghai kind of like, advanced railways and things like maglev trains. And then at the same time, they will turn around and say, no, we can't be classified as an advanced economy. We're still a poor developing country, because in Guizhou, there is still poverty. That being said, they also tout the fact that they have wiped out extreme poverty. So again, we have these contradictory messages. Just want to close our discussion on yet another contradictory message. This is all very confusing for people to sort out, which is why I'm so happy you're here to help us figure some of these things out. We talked about these global governance initiatives that they're doing. The development initiative and the governance initiative specifically are anchored inextricably into with the United Nations, particularly the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Chinese president and the Chinese elites talk consistently about the importance of the UN at the center of a multilateral, multipolar system. So it's a little bit surprising then when we read in the Financial Times reporting that China is delaying the settlement of its annual dues to the UN later and later each year, which is only weakening an already frail, embattled institution. So China's late settlement of its mandatory dues for the UN regular budget, and I'm quoting here from the FT, has crept from 2 months overdue in 2021 to 10 months overdue in 24. That's according to some FT analysis. Last year, China settled the final installment of its $480 million contribution on December 27th. So very, very late. The United States, by the way, is also notoriously late, oftentimes because of the funding cycles that come out of Congress. But let me just finish on this. China's share of the regular budget grew from less than 10% in 2000 to 20%, or $680 million in 2025, just shy of the 22% of the United States. And again, this is perplexing to me, because why don't the Chinese just write a check and make sure that the UN is stable and strong and viable? Why are they holding back on these payments at the same time when the United States is holding back on payments and other member countries are as well? You would think it would be in their interest to make sure that the UN doesn't teeter, especially because if the UN collapses or falls, and we heard the rhetoric from Donald Trump at the beginning of the show, that then brings down some of these initiatives that the Chinese are doing. Help us reconcile this apparent contradiction.
I think you're absolutely right that the Chinese need to take seriously the imperative of 知行合一, which is to do as you say and to align your actions with your words. And that's something that Wang Yangming talked about, by the way. He's a Confucian philosopher from Ming Dynasty. On a more serious and substantive note, this failure to pay one's dues, or rather their own dues to UN on time, is a problem that afflicts many countries. Whether it be the US, as you said, right? The US owed, I think, up to 670 million as of the end of last year, and China 280, 300 million. These are serious sums of money. In the case of China, I can only speak to that through a mixture of speculation and also assessment of secondary literature. I suspect it's a reflection of both the sort of underlying skepticism towards the efficacy and the vitality of the UN at times like these, but also, challenges domestically with regards to, of course, budget reshuffling and reallocations in a run-up to the fourth plenum this year and eventually a 21st Party Congress. There's a lot of very intense political reorganizing and restructuring going on behind the scenes in Beijing right now, and I can only speculate that perhaps the delayed payments have to do with uncertainty over who's taking charge of these payments, who should pay, why should we pay, who's going to claim credit, who can claim credit for delivering such payments on time. And because there's a dearth of teeth on a part of the UN, unfortunately, and a dearth of enforcement thus far, there haven't been any serious consequences, and as such, most countries tend to think, well, why don't we just free ride for as long as is possible until we really are getting folks rattling their knuckles on our doors saying, pay up. That's what I suspect has been going on. It's a very complex dynamic there on which I wish I'd known more, really, so to speak.
Yeah.
Final note I'd say is, if it is indeed the case that we live in the age of monsters, right, with the old world order declining purportedly and a new world struggling to be born, the question then becomes, what agency does everyone on this planet, not just the great powers of China and the US or maybe Russia or maybe the EU, but what about all the other important emerging regional powers such as India or ASEAN, and even to some extent Brazil, in Latin America? What roles do these actors and entities have to play? And this is where I think multilateral institutions are certainly one arena where we need all hands on deck. That when and where large powers choose to move away from these institutions at the core, others can and should seek to fill, at least in part, at least in portion, certainly by no means the entirety of the shoes that have been vacated and decanted. That, I think, is an important takeaway that I'd love to sort of conclude my remarks with, if that's okay with you, Eric.
No, that's wonderful. And two footnotes on that. One is, and again, these things that don't always align. I talked to a scholar in Beijing recently about the frustrations that China's UN ambassador, Fu Cong, has been expressing about how the international system at the UN just is not working, especially when it comes to Gaza. And if you see Fu's posts on Twitter, he is visibly frustrated over how the U.S. can just veto everything to the point where nothing gets done. And we see a much more expressive Chinese diplomacy in their frustration. So I think what you're saying, that frustration is best evidenced by Ambassador Fu. And I do encourage people to check out his Twitter feed to see this expression of frustration. At the same time, a source of mine at the UN commented to me, last week and said, listen, as the U.S. is effectively quiet quit the UN, and I mean, they're still paying dues and they're still showing up for things like the UNGA, but the U.S. has pulled out of the World Health Organization, they pulled out of UNESCO, they're pulling out of a lot of these smaller agencies and just not showing up. They're there in name, but not really. Apparently, the Chinese are moving in at these very mid-level and lower mid-level type of roles. And so, again, we see this enthusiasm for the UN system, particularly in the norm-setting bodies, and we see this frustration with the UN at the elite level, particularly at the Security Council. So interesting contradictions there. Brian, thank you so much for your time today and for helping us sort through these very complex issues. What are these governance initiatives? How do they fit within Chinese history, and how do they fit within the current order? Let's just wrap up very quickly. What should people take away from all of these initiatives that the Chinese are putting forward and that we're hearing from? Do they want to set new rules, or do they want to basically kind of fit within the space that's been afforded to them inside the Western-led international system? What should people take away from our conversation today and as they read stories about these new governance initiatives?
optionality. The key crux of the matter is optionality. When countries join and sign up to BRICS, when countries partner up with one another in launching developmental financing arrangements in the SCO, when countries enroll into the AIB and sign up for the Belt and Road Initiative, and indeed when China itself is trying to shape and contribute or construct, whatever you call it, its own role in relation to each of these multilaterals, what all of these countries are ultimately looking for is optionality as opposed to the construction of a coherent and viable and holistically complete system. Because China is very far from being able to, drive, let alone lead, an alternative to the West-led order from which it has and continues to benefit immensely. And so long as we realize that the interest codependence and interdependence between China and the West could actually help neutralize some of the more, jingoistic and perhaps revanchist and revisionist sentiments within the Chinese system, that engagement has been useful in constraining optionality sets as opposed to, pushing, right? The alternative to engagement is pushing the country into a corner and pushing it towards this drive towards self-sufficiency and alignment with truly non-West aligned actors, provided that we recognize this stark choice that confronts many policymakers in the West and beyond. I hope and remain cautiously optimistic that we can find ways as a collective of people, and by we I mean not just China or the US, but as a planet, where China could learn to live with, a West, and the West could also learn to live with a China that is considerably more potent and stronger than it was previously, with both parties remembering that the world is much larger than just China, the global north, so to speak, and China, that the global south too deserve representation and also autonomy in their own right, and that China should also respect the needs and voices of small and medium states around it, but also beyond its periphery. So I think that's a very convoluted way of saying, there's a lot of exciting developments in global geopolitics. Folks are looking for more autonomy at large. Where not such autonomy leads to a more productive and stable world order remains to be seen, but I remain cautiously hopeful.
I love the fact that we're ending on a cautiously optimistic note. It's not what I was expecting, and it's not what we hear that much these days. So once again, Brian Wong is an assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong and also a fellow at HKU's Center on Contemporary China and the World, and the author of a new book that came out earlier this year, Moral Debt: Defending a New Account of Reparative Justice. We'll put a link to that book and also the volume that he co-edited with Professor Tang He-Wei, Towards a Future for BRICS Plus. Brian, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you so much.
And we want to thank everybody for joining us today. If this is the kind of work and topic that you enjoy following, and these topics and these discussions with people like Brian, then you'll want to check out what we're doing over at the China Global South Project. We do daily coverage, insight, analysis, data visualizations, podcasts, videos. Most importantly, as Brian talked about, from the Global South. In fact, I am the only person on the team who is not from the Global South, although I live in the Global South. And so we bring perspectives not from London or New York or Washington, but from Nairobi, from Lima, Peru, from South Africa, Mauritius, Taiwan, all over the world. And so we hope that you'll take some time to check it out. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com. And if you want to support the work that we're doing and get the daily brief that Cobus and the team put together, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. And if you are a student or a teacher, including you, Brian, you can get 50% off, half off. Just send me an email, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I'll send you the student and academic links for those discounts. So for the entire team at CGSP around the world, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us on today's show. We'll be back again next week with another episode of the China Global South podcast. Until then, thank you for watching and for listening.